All right, so lead wrist angle, right? Everyone's talking about it. Like it's the secret to like unlocking crazy power in your golf swing.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
But is it really that simple? I mean, is there really just one like perfect lead wrist angle?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into today. We actually took a deep dive into this awesome webinar. It was with Chris Mason. He's an LPGA and PGA Tour coach.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, and also Dr. Phil Cheatham.
Okay.
He's a biomechanics expert, and get this, he's a co-founder of SportsBox AI.
Wow. Okay, so we've got some serious expertise here.
Yeah, they really get into like all the nitty-gritty of lead wrist angle. And I got to say, it's a lot more complex than I initially thought.
Okay, so like what's the biggest takeaway? What should our listeners be like most excited to learn about today?
Well, I think one of the things that really stood out to me was how they debunked some like common misconceptions about lead wrist angle.
Yeah.
And this whole thing about 3D analysis, it just blew my mind.
3D analysis. Okay, you're gonna have to like break that down for me. I always thought regular video was enough to, see what's happening with the wrist.
Right. You would think so. But Dr. Cheatham, he made this really interesting point. He said that a lead wrist angle that looks like, say, 45 degrees on a regular video could actually be totally different when you actually look at it in 3D.
Wow. Wait, really?
Yeah, like you could be way off. So it's like our eyes can deceive us when it comes to these subtle movements in the golf swing.
So like how do you even measure lead wrist angle in 3D?
Well, that's where technology like SportsBox AI comes in. It uses all these like motion capture sensors to get a super accurate picture of what's really going on.
Okay, so it's not just about what we see with our eyes, but like the actual data behind the movement.
Exactly.
So like once we have that 3D data, what are we looking for? What are the key things to pay attention to?
Well, first of all, you got to understand how the leader's angle changes throughout the entire swing. So like at the top of the backswing, you've got what's called wrist set. Then as you swing down towards impact, that angle starts to increase as you release the club.
That makes sense. So like what kind of numbers are we talking about here? What are the average lead wrist angles for say pro golfers?
Yeah, so at the top of the backswing, it's pretty similar for both men and women pros.
Mm-hmm.
They average around 85 to 89 degrees.
Okay.
And then at the release point, it's surprisingly close too, around 83 degrees for both.
Oh, wow. So men and women are pretty much the same in those positions.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting. The downswing.
Ooh, okay. I'm intrigued. What happens during the downswing?
So when they analyzed the lead wrist angle right around impact, they found that women pros were actually more released than men.
What? Really?
Yeah, it was kind of surprising. On average, women were at like 109 degrees compared to 102 degrees for men.
Wow, that's a pretty significant difference. Why is that? Is it just a strength thing or is there like a technique element at play?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The data doesn't really give us a clear-cut answer. It could be a bunch of things.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, strength could play a role. But it could also be swing mechanics, or even like club design. But Dr. Cheatham had this theory.
Okay.
He thought that strength probably plays a role, especially when you look at the overall patterns in lead wrist angle throughout the entire swing.
So even though women are more released at impact, their overall wrist action throughout the swing is pretty similar to men's.
Exactly. It's like they're using their wrists differently at different points in the swing to kind of compensate for those strength differences.
That's fascinating.
It is. But wait, there's more? Dr. Cheatham actually identified like 4 key lead wrist release profiles. And this is where things get really interesting.
4 different profiles. Okay, lay it on me. What are they?
Okay, so the first one is called early release, which is also known as casting.
Ah, yes, casting. I've heard that term thrown around a lot.
Right. So basically, this is when the wrist angle increases, like super fast at the very beginning of the downswing. It's almost like if you were throwing a ball underhand,
Right.
you're kind of releasing the club too early.
And I'm guessing that's not a good thing.
Generally, no.
Hmm.
Early release usually leads to a loss of power and control because you're basically fighting against your own momentum.
Okay, so what about the other profiles? What's the next one?
Okay, so the next one is fixed angle release. This is all about keeping a consistent wrist angle from the top of the backswing all the way down until like later in the downswing and then releasing just before impact.
So it's like a very controlled release, building up energy.
Exactly. Like imagine you're holding a tray of drinks and you want to keep them perfectly level as you walk. You got to keep that wrist nice and stable.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
What about the third profile?
All right, so this one's called downswing loading, and this is where it gets really cool. So with downswing loading, the lead wrist angle actually decreases or loads during the first part of the downswing. And then, boom, you release it towards impact.
So it's kind of like pulling back a slingshot.
Yes, exactly. You're storing up all that energy and then releasing it explosively.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So downswing loading is all about maximizing that stored energy.
You got it. And then lastly, there's late downswing loading. This one's kind of like a combination of fixed angle and downswing loading.
The hybrid?
Yeah, kind of. You basically delay the wrist release even further, which can help you generate even more power.
Wow, so many different ways to release the club. Okay, so why should the average golfer care about all these different profiles?
Because understanding your own lead wrist release profile
Hmm.
can be the key to unlocking more power and consistency in your swing. Like once you know how your wrist is working, you can start to identify any potential power leaks,
Yeah.
or any inefficiencies. And then you can work on developing a more powerful and controlled release.
So it's not just about mimicking what the pros are doing, but understanding how your own body moves
Right.
and then using that to your advantage.
Exactly. It's about like personalizing your swing to fit your own unique strengths and weaknesses.
I love that. So out of these four profiles, which one is the most powerful or the most efficient?
Well, they each have their pros and cons, but I think downswing loading is particularly fascinating because it taps into this crazy physiological mechanism called the stretch shortening cycle, or SSC for short.
Stretch shortening cycle. Okay, you're losing me again.
Think of your muscles like a rubber band. When you stretch it and let it go, it snaps back with way more force than if you just kind of pushed it forward. That's basically the SSC. It's this rapid lengthening, followed by a rapid shortening of the muscle.
So it's not just about how strong your muscles are, but how you actually use that strength to generate power.
You got it. It's about efficiency and timing.
So what are the specific benefits of this stretch shortening cycle? How does it actually translate to a more powerful golf swing?
Okay, so there are three main benefits to this SSC: pre-stretch, elastic energy storage, and the stretch reflex.
Okay, I'm all ears. Break those down for me. What's pre-stretch?
So pre-stretch is kind of like priming the muscle for action. Think about stretching that rubber band. The further you stretch it, the more potential energy it stores. That's what happens with your muscles when you lengthen them really quickly.
So the pre-stretch is like winding up for that big swing.
Precisely. And then you've got elastic energy storage, which is all about harnessing the natural springiness of your muscles and tendons.
Okay.
They actually store energy when they're stretched, and then that energy can be released during the contraction, giving you that extra boost of power.
So it's like your muscles have their own little built-in power source.
Exactly. And then lastly, there's the stretch reflex. This one's like your body's way of protecting itself from overstretching.
Okay.
When a muscle is stretched really quickly, the stretch reflex kicks in, and it causes the muscle to contract even harder.
So it's like a safety mechanism that also helps you generate more power. Pretty cool.
Right. So when you apply all of this to the golf swing, you can see how downswing loading really allows you to tap into this powerful mechanism.
Yeah, I'm starting to see the connection.
By loading the wrist during the downswing, you're basically stretching those muscles that are involved in the swing, storing up that energy, and then releasing it explosively at impact.
Okay, so that's the science behind why downswing loading can be so powerful.
Okay.
But what about in practice? Do all pro golfers use this technique?
Well, not necessarily. One of the most interesting parts of the webinar was when Chris Mason compared two of his players, Siwoo Kim, who has an extremely weak grip, and Brendan Steele, who has a super strong grip.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic difference in grip styles. I'm guessing their swings are totally different.
You would think so, right? But the fascinating thing is, they both hit the ball incredibly well, incredibly well, despite having such different grips. And that kind of challenges some of the conventional wisdom about, grip strength and how it relates to swing mechanics.
Yeah, so how is that even possible? How can they both be so successful with such different approaches?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into next. We're going to break down those key differences in their swings and see how they each manage to maximize their own individual strengths. Stay tuned.
Yeah, it really is amazing to see how they've both kind of figured out a way to make it work for them.
Yeah, for sure. So how do Kim and Steele actually achieve those powerful swings with their totally different grips?
Well, so Mason, he used data from SportsBox AI to analyze their swings.
Okay.
And it turns out Kim, with that weaker grip he generates, more body rotation
Right.
to help him square the club face at impact.
So it's like his body's doing more of the work. Exactly. And then steel with his stronger grip.
Yeah.
He relies more on, like, hand speed and a later release.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so they're kind of like compensating for their grip styles with different parts of their swing.
Exactly. Like, they've each found ways to maximize their own individual strengths, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this kind of brings us to another interesting point, the relationship between grip style and those lead wrist release profiles.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering if those were connected. So, like, does a weaker grip automatically mean you're going to be an early releaser or caster?
Well, that's a common misconception. A lot of people think
Yeah.
that,
Okay.
but it's not necessarily true.
Okay.
Dr. Cheatham pointed out that golfers with, like, totally different grip styles can effectively use a whole bunch of different release profiles.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. It's not really about the grip itself, but more about finding the right matchups for your own individual swing.
Okay, so it's like less about the grip itself and more about understanding how your grip influences your wrist action and then figuring out how to optimize that whole system together.
Exactly. It's like thinking about the bigger picture, not just focusing on one isolated element.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, to illustrate this point, Dr. Cheatham brought up this really interesting example, Scott Piercy.
Oh, Scott Piercy. Okay, what about him?
So, like, at first glance, when you watch his swing,
Yeah.
it totally looks like he's casting the club,
Really?
like releasing the wrist super early in the downswing.
Oh, interesting.
But, like, if you actually slow it down and look closely,
Yeah.
he actually reloads his wrist just before impact.
What?
It's almost like a two-part release.
Wow. Okay, so even a swing that looks like it's casting can actually be effective if the timing's right?
Exactly. It's all about the sequencing of movements and how they all work together to deliver that club face square to the ball.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Timing is everything in golf, right?
That's so true. Okay, so this whole discussion about grip styles and release profiles, it's making me think about like my own swing. How can I like figure out what my natural tendencies are and if they're helping or hurting my game?
That's where paying attention to your own swing really comes in.
Oh,
You don't necessarily need, like, fancy 3D analysis to start understanding your own lead wrist action.
okay, so like I can learn something just from being more mindful during my practice session.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Next time you're at the range or even just practicing your swing at home, try to really focus on how your wrist feels at different points in the swing.
Okay, like what specifically should I be paying attention to?
Well, just notice the angle of your wrist, like at address at the top of your backswing, during the downswing at impact.
Okay.
Does it feel loose, stable? Does it release early or late? Do you feel any tension? Is it consistent from swing to swing?
Okay, so it's all about becoming more aware of those subtle sensations in my wrist.
Exactly. The more you pay attention, the more you'll start to understand how your wrist action is actually affecting your ball flight.
That makes sense.
And then you can start experimenting with those small adjustments we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah, like tweaking my grip pressure or hand position to see how that impacts my wrist release.
Exactly. It's like your own little science experiment on the range.
I love that. It makes it like way more fun to practice when you're thinking about it that way.
Right. So, like, for example, if you think you might be casting the club, you could try, like, slightly strengthening your grip or focusing on keeping your wrist more stable during the downswing. And
Oh.
then see what happens, how that impacts your ball flight.
And what if I feel like I'm like not loading the wrist enough?
Yeah, then you could try, like,
Yeah.
weakening your grip a little bit or focusing on creating a more pronounced cocking of the wrist in the backswing.
Okay, so it's all about experimenting and seeing what feels right.
Exactly. The key is to play around with different feelings and see what produces the most consistent and powerful results for you.
This is such great advice. It feels really empowering to have this knowledge and to know that I can like experiment and figure out what works best for me.
That's the beauty of golf.
Yeah.
There's always something to learn and refine. It's a constant journey of discovery.
Yeah, for sure. This deep dive has been like a real eye-opener. I feel like I finally understand like all the complexities of lead wrist angle and its
Yeah.
impact on the swing.
I'm glad to hear that. But remember, we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore when it comes to the golf swing, and I encourage you to just keep learning and experimenting.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to do just that. This has been an incredible journey into the world of lead wrist angle. And, well, we're not done yet. We'll be right back after a short break to wrap things up with some final thoughts and a challenge for you to take with you to the course. Okay, so we're back. And I gotta say, after all this talk about lead wrist angle, I'm like itching to get out on the course and, put this knowledge to the test.
Yeah, that's the spirit. And actually, speaking of putting knowledge into practice, I have a little challenge for you.
Oh, a challenge. Okay, I'm game. What is it?
So it's pretty simple, really.
Mhm.
During your next round or even just your next practice session, I want you to really become aware of your lead wrist, like hyper aware.
Okay, so like consciously think about it during my swing.
Well, maybe not during the actual swing itself. You don't want to overthink things when you're trying to hit the ball, but definitely during your practice swings and in between shots, just really tune in to what your lead wrist is doing.
Okay, got it. So what should I be like feeling for? What are the key things to notice?
Just notice how your wrist feels at different points in the swing, like at address, at the top of your backswing during the downswing, at impact. Does it feel loose, stable? Does it release early or late? Do you feel any tension, any discomfort? Is it consistent from swing to swing?
Okay, so it's all about becoming more aware of those like subtle sensations in my wrist.
Exactly. The more you pay attention, the more you'll start to understand how your wrist action is actually influencing your ball flight.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then once I have a better sense of like what my wrist is doing, what do I do with that information?
Well, then the real fun begins. Experimentation. You can start making those small adjustments we talked about earlier.
Like tweaking my grip pressure or hand position to see how it impacts my wrist release.
Exactly. It's like you're conducting your own little science experiment out there on the range.
I love that. So it's all about like trial and error,
Yeah.
seeing what works best for me.
Exactly. Remember, there's no like one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to lead wrist angle. It's all about finding what works best for your individual swing and your body.
This is great. I feel like I have so much more control now, knowing that I can actually experiment and figure things out for myself.
Yeah, that's the beauty of golf. There's always something to learn and refine. It's a constant journey of discovery.
Well, I know I'm definitely going to be paying a lot more attention to my wrist from now on. This deep dive has been awesome. I feel like I finally get lead wrist angle.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, even the pros, they have different approaches to lead wrist angle. There's no single, like, correct way to do it. It's all about finding what works best for you.
Well, I guess that's it for today's deep dive. To
Mm.
all our listeners out there, the next time you're on the course, take a moment to like appreciate that little joint in your wrist. It might just be the key to unlocking your full potential.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to experiment. Golf is a game of constant learning. Keep exploring, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep having fun out there.
Thanks for joining us and happy swinging.